Good afternoon and welcome to this Institute for Historical Research Partnership Seminar, which is co-convened by the Engelsberg Applied History Programme at the Centre for Grand Strategy at King's College London and the Centre for Geopolitics at Cambridge University, and by the Foreign Common Development Office historians in the UK. I'm Suzanne Raine. Our subject this evening is Geopolitics, History and the US-China Rivalry. I'm joined today by Dr. Graeme Thompson and Dr. Robert Crowcroft. Graeme is Ernest May Fellow in History and Politics at the Belfer Centre for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. And in a previous life, Graeme was a policy analyst and speechwriter in Foreign Policy Planning Division at Global Affairs Canada. His comments tonight will be based on a new article that he has written in the Journal of Applied History. Rob is Senior Lecturer of Contemporary History at the School of History, Classics and Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. He's a specialist in political history, and he has a forthcoming book in 2022 on applied history coming out from Bloomsbury. Both Graeme and Rob are addressing in different ways great power politics and competition in the era of globalisation and what that means for world order. The format tonight is that Graeme and Rob will each speak for about 5 minutes to their papers, and then the three of us will have a conversation for about half an hour, pulling out some of the themes that they have raised. And then I will turn it over to you, the audience, to ask your questions. Please engage with us now. Start typing questions in the Q&A before we ask you to, and I will either try and pull them out while we're talking, or then I will ask them in the sort of audience Q&A session. So I look forward to hearing from you, the audience, soon. The aim is that we'll speak for about 60 minutes in total, so I should aim for this to be finished by about 6 p.m. So Graeme and Rob, it's lovely to have you both here. Thank you for joining us. I think, Graeme, we've decided we're going to start with you, so the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Suzanne, for that, for your introduction. I hope everyone can hear me okay. We're working amazingly. I'm actually in an office, so these are sort of the things we have to worry about. But thanks as well to the Centre for Grand Strategy, the Centre for Geopolitics, and the FCDO historians for putting on what I think is a really timely and important seminar series. I will keep my introductory remarks short, both because I'm conscious of our limited time, and also, as Suzanne said, I have developed a bit more at length these ideas in an article that's available online now with the Journal of Applied History. So, in short, I approach this issue of US-China geopolitical rivalry from the point of view of global and imperial history. This is where I cut my teeth for my doctoral research, and it builds on the work of historians like John Darwin, Anthony Hopkins, the late Christopher Bailey, and my Oxford doctoral supervisor, James Belich, who have sought to better understand the connection between globalization, geopolitics, and empire. As Hopkins and his co-author, Peter Kane, wrote in the revised edition of their classic British Imperialism, there is now a strong case for placing imperialism and empires at the center of world history, and specifically the history of globalization. And as Hopkins argues elsewhere, not only have imperial and hegemonic powers often served as globalizing forces that, by enforcing international order, lower or eliminate barriers to movement and exchange, but globalized systems also evolve in stages over time in response to shifting geopolitical, social, economic, or ecological conditions, often creating countervailing or competing forces. So in my article, and in my short remarks today, I try to demonstrate the utility of this global and imperial historical perspective by highlighting its application to three distinct crises of globalization and international order. I just will summarize very briefly because this is not quite germane to our subject, but you can see much more in the piece. First, drawing on the path-breaking work of ancient historian archaeologist Eric Klein, I consider the rapid and synchronized decline of the late Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean. You can see how globalization and international order can help us understand periods of the past, even at very remote times. Second, I move to the connection between the Silk Roads, the Mongol Empire, the Black Death, and the rise of the European empires. And for this, I draw heavily on Peter Frankopan as well as James Bellich's work. And third, on more familiar ground for me, I summarize the rise of 19th century globalization under the British Empire and its implosion with the outbreak of the First World War. And my point in this sort of very cursory historical tour is to demonstrate that globalization can end in crisis. This is not a teleological, forward-moving, inevitable movement, and that it's linked to geopolitical shifts. So if I may, as John Darwin observes, globalization has been subject to episodes, if not whole eras, of crisis, when the manic phase of economic expansion gave way to panic, autarky, or aggression, and the acceleration of demographic and geopolitical turbulence. No global order, he concludes, whether economic or geopolitical, has been fixed for long. So turning to contemporary geopolitics, I apply this sort of framework and think that we need to disentangle the concepts of international order and globalization. While some elements of the current international order date from 1945, it was only really with the onset of America's unipolar moment that accelerating globalization encompassing ever more of the planet truly emerged. One of the results has been the exponential growth of China. This presents a bit of a paradox, but one I think explicable in a historical perspective, that American hegemony facilitated a process of globalization that in turn contributed to the rapid emergence of new centers of economic, political, and military power, and thus the relative decline of the United States' geopolitical position. Geopolitical factors, including an increasingly assertive Chinese grand strategy, were thus driving the US and China apart even before the COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, the Chinese Communist Party policies like the Belt and Road Initiative and civil-military fusion can be seen as to fashion a new globalized system under a resurgent Chinese empire. And the fallout from COVID-19 has only accelerated this trend. Indeed, it is hard to imagine globalization and international order returning to the status quo ante, even when the pandemic has passed. So this points to a second sort of paradox, that COVID-19 is both a product and a solvent of the system of globalization and international order that has prevailed since 1989. The irony is that a pandemic facilitated by connectivity and integration, notably long-haul air travel, is aggravating geopolitical tensions likely to hasten the bifurcation of the international order and the emergence of two competing economic and strategic systems, one centered on the United States and the other on China. This could mean, in effect, a new imperial rivalry, already dubbed by some as Cold War II, that looks, in my mind, uncomfortably like the Anglo-German antagonism of the early 20th century, with economic power measured in digital rather than industrial prowess, military supremacy decided not by dreadnoughts, but in cyberspace, and with Taiwan playing the role of Belgium. This may be a portentous development, but the refashioning of globalization amid geopolitical turbulence is hardly surprising in the light of global and imperial history.
Thank you very much, Graeme. That's a great way for us to start. Rob, it's your turn now.
Yes, thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Graeme. Terrific opening remarks there. Very pleased to be here. I'd like to talk about something building off of Graeme's paper, but also going in a slightly different direction. And that's about enmity. Few things concentrate the mind quite like enmity. There's no substitute for a good hate, you might say. But enmity is one of the darker and animal forces of politics and statecraft. Threats focus our attention and demand a response. Understanding what we're against helps us to understand what we're for. As the German legal thinker Carl Schmitt put it, the specific political distinction that is the basis for all political activity and impulses is the distinction between friend and enemy. Now, the primacy of enmity as what I call a political lubricant was one of the great insights of Schmitt. And I think that, like another clever, unpleasant extremist, Lenin, Schmitt peered into the heart of modern politics and offered us lots of pregnant insights. Scholars as intellectually diverse as Philip Bobbitt and Brendan Sims at Cambridge have mined Schmitt's concepts of various kinds for their wisdom. And remember that Plato himself divided politics into friends and enemies. So this is a very old way of thinking. There is, I think, now an emerging bipartisan consensus in the United States that the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party is not merely a rival, but actually an enemy. The outlines and parameters of that consensus remain unclear. We're still in the early stages of it, but it's clearly occurring. And historically speaking, I think it looks pretty much like what we would expect. And of course, we detect similar trends in capitals across the world, though reactions vary considerably. Nevertheless, the strategic rivalry between China and the US, which was submerged for years beneath an ocean of trade, is now the dominant geopolitical reality of our time. And for its part, China, of course, has long been perfectly clear that America is its enemy, its adversary. Its diplomacy, economics, and defense planning have been conducted more or less openly on that basis for quite some time. So one of the things that I think we're seeing is that the long dormant motor of American strategic competition is slowly roaring back into life. Diplomacy, military procurement, research and development is all being conducted in a more intensive fashion than they have for decades. Commercial activities increasingly viewed with at least one eye on implications for geopolitics within the Indo-Pacific. I think Schmitt's insight retains its potency. There is no substitute for an enemy. Sad to say, that's the reality of human nature. Now, and we'll get into this, I think, in more detail in the subsequent conversation, but historically speaking, very similar things happened in the 1940s and the 1950s as Washington policymakers were forced to confront the very different realities of Soviet power. Now, this realization called forth an extraordinarily fertile response, huge institutional and bureaucratic overhauls, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO, containment, thermonuclear deterrence, and so on. None of that, I think, would have been possible politically or intellectually without the palpable peer threat posed by the USSR. History provides us with innumerable other examples of the political and psychological value of clarity about one's adversaries. Now, that clarity might be used for good or ill, but nevertheless, it's always there. For Elizabethan England, the Spain of Philip II was the black legend, a source of evil and an existential threat to a godly people. French leaders made similar use of the threat posed by Habsburg Spain to drive their own strategic clarity over decades. If we go much further back, for the Roman Republic, of course, the power and wealth of Carthage necessitated an unprecedented degree of commitment. Senators had no doubt as to the scale of the Carthaginian challenge. In the early 16th century, the Sweden of King Gustavus Adolphus was surrounded by enemies from Denmark to Poland, Russia to the Habsburg. And the Swedes employed the clarification of mind that offered to turn themselves into a great power, and indeed the leading army in Europe. Modern day Israel, of course, has similarly leveraged the psychology of strategic threat to great effect. So there is then, I think, historically speaking, a certain attraction in enmity. not least in its power to simplify matters. And a recognition of those hard realities and clarity about what that entails remains, sad to say, the indispensable foundation of prudent statecraft. I'm going to shut up in a moment, but another point just to end on, and again we'll come back to this, is that one thing that we're seeing a lot of in recent years are commentators, politicians, intellectuals being mesmerized by, awestruck by, intimidated by the new power of China. There are very good reasons for that, which we'll talk about. But at the same time, these pathologies are not actually new. I think they're reflective of our tendency to catastrophize that we all have. We see similar responses to the Soviet Union, to Nazi Germany. And it's important that the United States and more broadly the West don't understate their own capabilities and the capacity for adaptation and ingenuity of the liberal parliamentary free market states.
Thank you, Rob. Sorry, I was unmuting myself. Thank you both for that. I think that we should probably deal with the issue of Cold War II straight away so that we can knock that on the head and then move on to the rest of the conversation. So I'm going to invite you both to offer your views on whether or not it is a helpful or an unhelpful analogy or phrase for us to be using when we're talking about this new power rivalry.
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
Is that okay? So Cold War II is a phrase which Neil Ferguson has deployed. It's a deliberately provocative framing. There are some important analogical limitations to it, but nevertheless, I think it helps to fertilize thinking. It helps us to flush out the problem, to articulate it and think about similarities and differences. I think that in some ways, the Cold War II framing is quite helpful because it underlines the capacious scope of a competition over the future of world order. And this is a competition that is clearly going to structure international relations and even the domestic affairs of many states for decades to come. So in that sense, it's helpful. But there are limitations to it. The People's Republic of China is not the Soviet Union. In some ways, it's less threatening. In other ways, more so to the United States. The United States of 2021 is not the United States of the 1940s. Several commentators, I think, perceptively have pointed out that in some ways, Imperial Germany is a better analogy, in that you have, a rising power with a chip on its shoulder, determined to acquire a dominant role and reshape the international system in line with its preferences, yet also acutely conscious of what it perceives as a window of geopolitical opportunity that may close in the near future. On the other hand, China has behaved, so far at least, in a way that's more restrained than Germany. These are not transferable models. What they can do, though, I think, is help us to think. It's natural that Americans in particular will mine the Cold War model. The geopolitical situation is not the same. But between the 1940s and the 1980s, the United States authored what I would say was one of the most impressive and important grand strategic performances in recorded history. And therefore, it would be very surprising indeed, frankly, if they didn't mind that, if policymakers and commentators didn't discuss that and what we can glean from it. So just to give two examples, the Truman administration had a number of very important qualities, but the first, I think, was that Truman decided to make Soviet behavior rather than Soviet rhetoric the acid test. This was an astute choice. He instinctively distrusted fine words. He viewed them as meaningless if actions contradicted them, and therefore the rhetoric of peaceful coexistence and commitment to democracy and so on that the Kremlin liked to come out with, that was actually much less important than the hard reality of what they did. A second element of the Truman administration's grand strategy that is important here, and I think pregnant with lessons, is imagination. the Truman administration was very imaginative in improvising a grand strategic response in extremely dangerous and uncertain conditions. We see this in the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and NATO. A third and final point about the Truman administration that is, I think, always worth drawing upon was persuasion. Truman and his advisors were energetic in delivering speeches and engaging with other elected officials and via the media, the public. The process of constant engagement and explanation was fundamental to gradually developing an approach that could command legitimacy. Now, if we look at the Eisenhower administration, and I will shut up in a minute so Graeme can come in, I think Eisenhower resembles a model for considered strategic analysis. The reshaping of the National Security Council helped to achieve effective integration between the different agencies of government. This was attained by direct and ongoing presidential involvement in order to guarantee the attention of the relevant officials. Eisenhower rendered the National Security Council the central forum for strategic discussion. Of course, the Eisenhower administration settled on, for good or ill, I would say, ultimately for good, the primacy of the threat of thermonuclear war as a paradoxical means of peace. So the geopolitical situation is different, but it would be very strange indeed if trying to think about lessons and things to do and not to do, how to engage in this kind of a rivalry. It would be very strange indeed if the Cold War wasn't mined. And in that sense, I think it's a useful source of both insights and examples.
Thank you, Rob. So Graeme, I'm going to build on that in the question that you get, which is the issue that Rob has raised about enmity. It's really important to understand both perspectives on this. And there's clearly a question about kind of who starts the enmity and does it matter who starts the enmity? That if what Rob is saying is true, and the US is definitely talking about Cold War II and may seek to get into that mindset, does that in a way increase the likelihood that we're going to end up in a situation which feels like Cold War II?
That's a great question. I do. Well, I think there is some danger that you start walking yourself down a particular path by being overly reliant on a particular framing or analogy. I would agree with a great deal of what Rob put forward. I think there's a lot there, particularly for US grand strategy, looking at the Cold War and seeing what went well, because obviously a lot did. The concern, perhaps, is that if your only tool is a Cold War analogy, then every nail, so to speak, starts looking like a Cold War. And from my point of view, I do think that there is a tendency among the American foreign policy establishment, among American intellectuals and historians, to focus on the American experience of great power, which is necessarily almost a 20th century experience and a Cold War experience. And that comes at a risk of downplaying or ignoring other examples from history, which might be more, or at least equally, enlightening, as well as I think one of the benefits of a more global view is thinking about, is sort of an ability to develop strategic empathy and to see the situation from the point of view of your rival, if only to understand their actions in response. And so in this realm of sort of highlighting other examples, I would sort of go back to the Anglo-German antagonism as a potentially fruitful one. Again, not to overstate the ways in which it is similar, because there are important differences, nuclear weapons being the one that comes to mind immediately. But nonetheless, we have a case of, as Rob mentioned, a rising power looking for its place in the sun, a little bit worried about its window of opportunity. And it came in a context of an existing framework of integration and globalization, where the two were each other's largest trading partners, and a situation where I think there is a tendency, maybe among historians and potentially among contemporaries, to have overstated the extent of British decline in the late 19th century. They did win the arms race with the dreadnoughts in the early 20th century. And so again, it maybe is a bit of a warning not to, as Rob rightly said in his remarks, not to count out the United States and liberal democracy too soon, because there's a lot of deep sources of strength there, which I think it would be folly to overlook.
Thank you, but Rob, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just following up on Graeme's point, because I think he made a number of compelling points there, but one that struck me was what he said about the limitations of historical analogies and the limitations of the Cold War. And that, I think, speaks to, you know, one of the great merits of what has become known as applied history, which is essentially an attempt to encourage people to think more broadly about their analogies. So, you know, as Graeme has articulated and I sort of hinted at, in some ways, the Anglo-German antagonism prior to 1914, you know, has many. Is in some ways a better analogy than the Cold War. It's a neater geopolitical fit in some ways. But one of the problems that we've got now, because of the way in which, for various reasons, history, particularly political and diplomatic history, has fallen out of favor, is that we have a vanishingly small number of analogies in circulation. Every time there's any kind of international standoff, it's 1938 in the Munich crisis. Anytime there's economic turbulence, is it the World Depression all over again, or at best it's the 1970s? And so on. So we have a very limited pool of analogies to draw upon. Most of those that we do have to draw upon are nearly all 20th century. They're nearly all Western, either European or American. And, you know, history, generally speaking, and humanity more broadly, actually have a lot to teach us. So I think one of the really important elements of applied history is just encouraging people to think more broadly, to diversify the range of analogies that they can draw upon. Not all of them will be readily transferable or identifiably the same, but a great deal can actually be put to use in terms of trying to work out, you know, how far things are the same, where are they different, are they different in important ways, and so on. So these are tools for thinking with. Moreover, we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking about history in terms of analogies necessarily, or just in terms of analogies, because to mention the Cold War points that I spoke about with the Truman administration and the Eisenhower administration, the geopolitical situation with the US and China is very different. But the question of what did the Americans do right in the 1940s and what did they do right in the 1950s? What can we learn from that? That I would suspect is transferable. Why? Because it's simply good political practice. That, I think, is a key point. If you're trying to think about, you know, how you formulate a strategy and how you navigate these situations, you start with good political practice. And in that sense, you know, history is wide open.
Thank you. So that brings. I'm going to try and meld 15 questions into one. Quite a lot about, and this picks up on what you're saying, quite a lot about the conversation that we generally have every day about China and America and this Thucydides trap and everything. There's something in that conversation about inevitability. So there is a cycle which will be essentially growth, competition, rivalry, enmity, war, destruction, beginning again, empires don't last, all those sort of things. And those points that you've just made, Rob, are essentially how can we apply history to break an inevitable cycle in different ways. And so I've got several questions bound up One is about the importance of understanding the enemy, the rival, and the risks of not understanding on both sides, and what we might learn from other examples in history of where something has been de-escalated through greater understanding. And a second question, which is tangential to that, is about whether red lines or strategic ambiguity work better when you're trying to deal with your competitor. So essentially, what is the best way to avoid escalation? What is the best way to boost understanding and, in theory, to de-escalate? I'm going to go to Graeme first. Start where you want with those.
No, it's such a huge subject. You could go in so many directions. I think that I can, if I dare speak for historians, I'm sure we'll want to avoid the word inevitable. We understand that, and this goes back to a very deep sort of argument in historical methods and thinking about history and the philosophy of history is it macro historical processes, the tectonic plates, or do the decisions of individuals affect outcomes? And the obvious answer, like in the nature-nurture debate, is it's both. It clearly is both. And so when you're presented with a situation like this, where the geopolitical tectonic plates are very clearly rubbing up against each other, and we can see from past examples of what Graham Allison has called the Thucydides trap, that rising powers are likely often to find themselves in conflict with established powers for reasons we can all understand, which does then put the emphasis on policymakers, because they do have the opportunity, constrained by economic and geopolitical forces, to make decisions and to implement policies which can seek a détente or an understanding, or at least, as you point out with the question about red lines, knowing what is a red line and what is not, which brings me back to the 19th century, early 20th century example. And I think it's fair to say, although condensing Margaret Macmillan and Christopher Clark's books into one talking point is probably a dangerous thing to do, but I think it is fair to say that Imperial Germany was not perhaps fully aware of the extent of the British commitment to France, and there had been the development of sort of a great deal of uncertainty even within the British cabinet up until the last moment whether Britain would intervene if Belgian neutrality was violated. And previously, during the Franco-Prussian War, Gladstone had made very clear that the British position was that they would stay out provided that Belgium was not violated. And indeed it wasn't, and Britain stayed out, and that war ended relatively quickly, though not in the way the French might have wanted. So clearly identifying red lines, at least in that case, you could make the argument that policymakers in doing that can potentially avoid those tripwires that they're not expecting, and also by informing their approach by history, at least come to understand how it is that the other side views their own red lines, and hopefully avoid any potential for catastrophe. I turn it over to Rob on this one, though.
It's really interesting. It's a very live debate at the moment. So whether US posture on Taiwan should be to leave the Chinese guessing about what they'll do, or whether they should be really clear that you can do this but not this. Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I think on Taiwan and more broadly throughout the Indo-Pacific, one of the geopolitical dilemmas that Washington faces is the deliberate ambiguity of the regional players. How attached is Taiwan to its own independence or de facto independence? Are they willing to undertake the military measures which most analysts think are necessary in order to seriously deter the Chinese over the long term? And there's a big question mark over that. What is absolutely the case is the United States should not be more committed to the de facto independence of Taiwan than Taiwan itself. So, and then you look at India, of course, there are important and similar questions there. So on one level, you look at the strategic balance within the Indo-Pacific, and you say, well, actually, if in crude terms, you think of America plus Japan plus India in some kind of alignment, that's more than enough to check the Chinese on any foreseeable timescale. But on the other hand, as I say, the regional players are deliberately ambiguous for their own perfectly sensible strategic reasons. So that, I think, is a complicating factor and highlights the importance of strategic empathy, which Graeme talked about. We have to try and understand things from the perspective of others. Also, I think highlights the importance, to go back to the Truman administration, of diplomacy and persuasion, and working really hard to try to get people on board with a course of action. But I would also agree with Graeme on inevitability. I don't think anything here is really inevitable. I don't think that there will be war. I mean, you mentioned war, Suzanne, as part of the cycle here. Maybe I'm being naive, although nobody ever accused me of being optimistic, but I very much take the view that thermonuclear deterrence still holds, and major nuclear powers are not going to start sinking one of those aircraft carriers in the South China Sea, simply because the scope for escalation is so great that the decision-making calculus is altered in fundamental ways by nuclear weapons. Moreover, even just in terms of a conventional war, I'm not sure that any one strategic position would be better after even a limited fight than was the case beforehand. So I don't think war is inevitable. Certainly not. I don't think it's probable. Is it possible? Absolutely, because of miscalculation, because of friction. And it's in that context that I think being mindful of what history could teach and warn is of such fundamental importance. Is war inevitable? No. Is it probable? No. Is it possible? Yes. But actually, even if war doesn't happen, then that actually opens up a much larger range of political and historical problems, because you then have to navigate essentially a prolonged strategic rivalry, which potentially stretches decades into the future. And that has all kinds of implications, from espionage to industry, to alliance politics, and so on a global scale. So even if you don't end up in war and you have a competition that is more benign, nevertheless, that is itself a really demanding political challenge.
Thank you. So one final question from me, and I know that we've had too many, but I want to just ask you both, if you could, to speak about what we could learn from history and from these examples about the role of the middle powers, the other states, in when you have a situation where you have two rival sort of dominant forces. Is it helpful or not helpful for all the other states to pick sides and thereby to create opposing blocks? Graeme first.
It's a bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, isn't it? I mean, I think it's Thucydides that's coursing in my mind, but the strong will do what they will and the weak will suffer what they must. And at some point, the great powers are the ones that make the weather, and it's foolish to pretend otherwise. At the same time, well, and just to follow from that, I think middle powers will have to recognize a little bit where their bread is buttered in this situation. And you see the tensions or the dichotomous ways that New Zealand and Australia are beginning to deal with China as two examples of, on one hand, a sort of, I'm not going to say the A word, which is appeasement, but one which is a bit more, trying to find something that's not appeasement, but you see what I mean. Australia is taking a bit of a hard line, and New Zealand is taking a much softer line with trade at the forefront of their concerns. And they do, at the end of the day, have to live in the same neighborhood as China. So there's something to be said there. But on the other hand, I think middle powers especially have an interest in developing an international architecture, or pushing in some ways to avoid the bifurcation. They stand to lose more than anyone in a system where might makes right. And I think that they're for the great powers, they also have an interest in keeping the smaller powers on side. So, I come back to my initial comment is you can see how both sides of that could potentially play out. You did have a bit of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War was important, but the real sort of crux of the issue was, at the end of the day, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And I think there is limited autonomy for middle powers. We have to be realistic about that. But at the same time, they do have an interest in making sure that this is not entirely a great power game. So again, it's not an enviable position to be in, that's for sure.
So Rob, does that mean the only option for the middle powers is to rely on the kind of multinational, multilateral institutions as their means by which they kind of find a middle ground through this?
Yeah, I mean, I would associate myself, I think, with pretty much everything that Graeme has said. And just building on that, one thing I would add is that we mustn't lose sight of the fact, in this conversation about world order and global rivalry and so on, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that virtually every country in the world, really with just the exception of the United States and the way it defines its interests, is a regional power at best. World politics, global politics, is primarily regional politics. And that's not to say, of course, that the global dimension isn't immensely important, particularly when we're talking about a contest to structure world order. But most states will view things through their own lens, and that means the lens of their own neighborhood. Graeme has talked about New Zealand and Australia. This is true, of states across the Indo-Pacific. But one of the things that we see here in Britain, right on the other side of the world, over the past few weeks, is this debate, which has been driven by Professor John Bew of King's College London, who's been working on a review of British grand strategy. And there's a question there to which there's genuinely no easy answer as to whether or not, if you are a mid-ranking power in the North Sea, to what extent do you become involved in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific? There are good reasons for and against. Japan, for decades really, although the situation becomes trickier, has actually done a fairly good job of being a mid-ranking power who are able to just stay out of all kinds of unfortunate situations. A highly integrated, globalized maritime state, but they have been able to just let things glide past them. So there are genuine dilemmas here, and what I think is key for mid-ranking states of various kinds, whether they're responsible international stakeholders like various European powers, whether they're disruptors like Iran and so on, is that we always have to bear in mind that world politics, for the most part, is actually regional politics, and the relevant scale through which these issues are perceived in capitals across the world will often be quite different from the way they're perceived in Washington or increasingly in Beijing. And yes, to answer your question, Suzanne, this does mean for mid-ranking powers, international institutions of various kinds are one potential means of force multiplication. On the other hand, there are real limits, of course, to these kinds of things. You could look at the World Health Organization now, and the question is it essentially just a tool of Chinese propaganda, basically? You could look at various UN entities, the EU and so on. So the extent to which multilateral institutions are actually up to the job, I think, could be really questioned over the past half decade or so, which is not to say that they're going to go away, but there is a question as to how can they be made to run better, and also awareness of the limitations to them.
Thank you, Rob. And of course, they're not going to be an alternative if they're dominated by one or other of the great powers who are rivals. So there's a whole nother applied history seminar in that topic, which we haven't got time for now. I'm going to start asking audience questions, and please, if you do send a question, actually give your name and affiliation if you have one, just so we can attribute it. I'll start with a question from Garrett Fitzgerald, which is about dependency, actually. So his point is that the US is actually heavily dependent on China, particularly the US scientific enterprise, which rests on Chinese expertise. But I mean, I think that dependency works both ways. And his question is, does this represent a strategic vulnerability that didn't pertain in previous big power competitions? And I would argue that that strategic vulnerability could be seen from either perspective. Graeme? Yeah,
just very shortly, because it's not, one has to admit when one is not an expert in a particular area, but you can definitely see how, with the onset of sort of so-called dual use digital technologies, this has made it much more difficult in a certain way to continue to have a high level of economic, technological, and scientific integration, when we know that the same technologies, which can be used every day for peaceful purposes, are also potentially the technologies which are going to tilt the military balance. And when you have the CCP policy of civil-military fusion, whereby no company really owns its own intellectual property, and they're engaged in strategic espionage and intellectual property theft, it does become very hard to maintain those ties. And I think that is, the new frontier, so to speak, of warfare is really cyberspace and outer space. And at the end of the day, those are both computers. So it's kind of one realm. And that really hinges on control over and mastery of digital technology, artificial intelligence, semiconductor supply chains. It's going to be very difficult, I think, from a strategic point of view, from the United States perspective, but also the Chinese perspective. Xi Jinping has talked about Made in China 2025, and they're trying to de-Americanize their supply chains in a similar way that the West is now thinking about rebooting its supply chain. So I think it's going to be very hard to maintain this level of integration, and I think that may be something quite different from previous ages in history. Although, technological exchange, somebody invents something and pretty soon the other side has it, whether this is a crossbow or a nuclear weapon. So you could go on for a while about whether it's the same or different, but I think in this case, it's going to be very difficult not to find the need to disengage a little bit.
So Rob, that's what Graeme's just said is interesting, because he's talking about reduced dependency over time, disengagement, building up this whole building of two systems. That would reduce the level of cooperation and understanding. And in our earlier discussion, we sort of said it's the most important thing is to understand where the other one's coming from. Is that not so? So is it better to have the dependencies and the sort of the interactions?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure they're exclusive. You can enhance your understanding and strategic empathy of where the other person is coming from, essentially, while also trying to ensure that you are less beholden to them in certain vulnerable areas. So I agree with Graeme. I think there is a degree of strategic uncoupling that is taking place. I think that if we look ahead to, say, 2030, that uncoupling will probably be significantly more pronounced than it is now. It's taken several decades to build it up. Even with political focus, over the past 3 or 4 years, it's a slow process. But I think if we look ahead to 2030, the degree of uncoupling will be significant. I don't think that necessarily means a reduction in strategic empathy. But look, I mean, the reality is that I think the facilitation of China's rise over the past 30 years or so may well prove to be the gravest error in the history of American statecraft, because booming commerce with the West has been the principal source of income that's financed the People's Republic of China's development. Of course, there are big questions. Can they elude the coming demographic crunch and escape the middle income trap? I'm not an economist, so I won't speculate on that score. But the reality is that China and the Communist Party remains a one-party totalitarian state that still places hundreds of thousands of its own citizens in concentration camps. All rights are dependent upon party whim. Minorities are subjected to coercive measures. The regime has established the single most elaborate and sophisticated censorship state that humanity's ever constructed. They've done this very quietly over the past 7 or 8 years. And in a context in which the character of the regime is unambiguous, and there is on both sides a clear recognition of the value of decoupling, there are incentives to decouple. I just don't see any way, frankly, that there isn't a degree of disengagement. Now, what that looks like and whether that creates a kind of bipolar world, I'm not sure. We'll have to see, I guess. But I think it's pretty. I was going to say never use the word inevitable. In fact, we did say that, but it seems to me to be almost inevitable that over the next 10 years that there will be that decoupling. I think
it's interesting because I think we do think in terms of inevitability quite a lot, even if we're not allowed to say it. I'm going to ask a question from someone whose name I'm not going to pronounce very well, which is Kaan Kutlu Artaç, I think, from Mersin University in Turkey. So it's lovely that we're being joined by someone in Turkey, who asked a really important question about how long this is all going to take. So is there something we can learn from history about not that anything's inevitable, but how long we should expect this power competition to go on before in some way something else happens? Graeme, you've studied the Mongol Empire.
I should say I haven't really studied the Mongol Empire, but I've stolen a fair bit from Peter Frankopan and James Belich for my piece. But look, it's very hard to say. Rob made the point that this could be a decades-long thing. One can also imagine, again, to stay away from inevitability, a lot depends on the internal character of the Chinese regime, something which I'm not an expert in, but a lot of close China watchers have opinions on. But I think stepping back a little bit, you can make the argument in a way that history is moving faster, more connected than we used to be. Events seem to take place more quickly. And part of that is related to technological progress and the exchange of information. You no longer really need ambassadors to send letters back to their capitals because the leaders just speak on Zoom. So events happen faster than they used to. And I think so you could make an argument that this is really a long-term, the tectonic plates are what they are, but you could also suggest that perhaps events will take place faster than we can imagine.
And they don't need to take place in all the things that we're talking about are essentially ways that you might not end up in an escalation towards greater enmity, which brings you back to sort of Rob's point, which is that we need enemies. Rob, do you have a quick view on timescale? And I'll try and fit one more question in before we finish.
Yep, sure. I mean, it seems to me that the most likely outcome, and there are multiple plausible outcomes, but the most likely outcome, and this I think is in line with what Graeme was suggesting, is that this rivalry will probably continue until either there's a significant change in the nature of the Chinese regime or its fundamental international goals, or something similar happens in the United States. Because these are the two big powers in the international system. They seem likely to remain that way for the foreseeable future. If I had to pick a winner, or if I could just speculate on which regime will be the more robust, I would still pick the American one. While there's no doubt that if you look at how things have become for America over the past few years, with frankly the poison of identity politics and so on, America is looking like a cautionary tale at the moment. But on the other hand, there was no, if you know anything about American history, there was never a sort of golden age of political harmony in America. This is I think a sort of post 1950s myth. And for all the present tumult in the United States, the fact that the Chinese regime spends comparable amounts on policing its citizens as it does on defense suggests that this is not a self-confident regime. But this is all speculation. We just don't know. It could potentially go on for a very, very long time.
Okay, we have got 4 minutes left. I'm going to try and merge 3 questions into one. So we have a question from KJ Chen at the University of Cambridge, who asks us to talk about geography. And I had just been thinking while you were talking, is it simply a fact that America and China are huge countries? So there is a geographical element to this, surely, because they're just huge countries. You're always going to have bigger countries and smaller countries. And then 2 other questions which are sort of linked, one from Edgar Barroso in Mozambique and one from Professor Rasmus Bertelsen at the Arctic University of Norway, both of which are saying, kind of we're having a sort of Western conversation here, and why, firstly, would China see it like this? And secondly, why do we need to be this worried about China? So you now have 3 minutes to deal with that. Graeme first.
I'll be very brief. Obviously, size and geography matters. Of the largest countries in the world, these are 2 of them. The largest economies in the world. This is why they matter, and they meet in the Pacific. So there's not much you can do to get away from that. And it is, our perspective is a bit of a Western. We're speaking English. I'm sitting in the United States. You're speaking from the United Kingdom, where we have a Western perspective. But I think that's part of the usefulness of history, and particularly of a global perspective, is to think about how others see the world, have seen the world, and have developed over time, which helps to broaden one's horizons from things which are more quotidian in your everyday experience. So I think that history can give us something to get over the limitations of our own horizons.
Thank you. And Rob, on that one, that question about seeing things from China's perspective, personally, I think that's tremendously important, which is why the idea of becoming blocs that disengage troubles me, because the room for it, you just increase the chance of miscalculation through misunderstanding. What do you think? What more do you think could be done to reduce that, given the fact that, as Graeme said, we're all sitting over here?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think fundamentally, a good starting point is to spend lots of time reading Chinese history, all the way back to the Warring States period, trying to understand Chinese strategic culture, its development over time, trying to understand the competing and different Chinese traditions for thinking about the world and China's place in the world and relationship with other powers and so on. So I think just reading history fundamentally is a good place to start. But on the point about geography, and Graeme talks about the Pacific, I'm a little bit more optimistic here, because they do meet in the Pacific. But on the other hand, the Pacific is the largest space on Earth. In some ways, they're a very, very long way away from one another. And that, I think, does create opportunities in ways that are, frankly, good for humanity, in the sense that they don't directly border one another. You know, this is not a Germany-France situation where they are, literally right next door to one another. I do think the fact that they are on opposite sides of the largest space on Earth does create some opportunities, hopefully for moderate politics. Now, of course, various parts of Asia are increasingly congested, so that's where the trouble spots are. But nevertheless, I do look. I mean, I've got a sort of map of the world above my desk, and I'm looking at it now, and golly, they do seem a long way away from one another. And that, I think, in this context, is probably no bad thing.
Thank you. And you reminded me just then of a question I was going to ask earlier, which is, do we have historical examples where rivals have also worked together constructively to solve problems? And if I sort of draw it to a close on that note, that obviously we're very hopeful that the US and China can work together to lead the world on things like climate change and global health, because it's not going to work if they're pulling in opposite directions on that. I'd like to thank both of you and to invite you in 3 sentences to explain as a historian what you see, why you want to be a historian, and how you see history as being useful when we're talking about modern statecraft and geopolitics, as a nice note to end on, to hopefully encourage more people to become historians in the future.
Well, I'll go first if I can. John Robert Seeley told his students that, of all the reasons to study history, one was preeminent above all others. History is the school of statecraft. History is literally the only database of experience and knowledge that we have to draw upon when thinking about prudent politics. And therefore, in that sense, there is no more useful toolkit for trying to approach some of these problems.
Brilliant, Graeme.
I would echo that very much. I know Robert has written a little bit on R.G. Collingwood and his view of the value of history. I would highlight, I'm afraid, maybe parochial, but Robert is sitting in Edinburgh, David Hume, writing about whether politics can be reduced to a science. And he says, well, we ought to apply a scientific method to politics, but the likelihood that we can, judge outcomes scientifically is very minimal. But if we are to try, the only experiments, so to speak, that we have are history. This is the experience of the past, which allows us the materials upon which we can reason about politics in the present. So I would put myself in the Humean camp on that one. Thank you. So in the context of being a living experiment, I would like to thank you both very much for your time. It's been a terrific discussion. I hope you, the audience, have enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you both very much indeed.